It is always a hard question to ask where to begin to tell the story of history of psychology. Some would start with ancient Greece, others would look to demarcation in the late 19th century when the science of psychology was formally proposed and introduced. These two perspectives and all that in between are appropriate for describing a history of psychology. The earliest records of a psychological experiment go all the way back to Pharaoh of Egypt in the 7th century BC. Psychology is an exciting field, and the history of psychology offers the opportunity to make sense of how it is grown and developed. The history of psychology also provides perspective. Rather than a dry collection of names and dates, the history of psychology tells us about the important intersection of time and place that defines who we are. Consider what happens when you meet someone for the first time. The conversation usually begins with a series of questions, such as where did you grow up? Where did you go to school? Everything began with a history. The same is true for studying the history of psychology. Getting a history of the field helps to make sense of where we are and how we got here. Precursors to American psychology can be found in philosophy and physiology. Philosophers such as John and Thomas promoted empiricism, the idea that all knowledge comes from experience. The work of Locke and Reid and others emphasize the role of human behavior and the premises of senses in defining how the mind comes to acquire knowledge. German psychologist Hermann measured the speed of neural impulse and explored the physiology of hearing and vision. His work indicated that our senses could deceive but are not a mirror of external world. Such work showed that even though the human senses are fallible, the mind could be measured using the methods of science. The question of relationship between mental and material was investigated by a number of German researchers, including Ernst Weber and Gestalt Fechner. Their work was called Psychophysics and introduced methods for measuring the relationship between physical stimuli and human perception that would serve as the basis for a new science of psychology. William Wundt is considered one of the founding figures of modern psychology. The formal development of modern psychology is usually credited to the work of German physician, physiologist, and philosopher William Wundt. Wundt helped to establish the field of experimental psychology by serving as a strong promoter of the idea that psychology could be an experimental field, and by providing classes and a laboratory for training students. In 1875, he joined the faculty of university and quickly began to make plans for the creation of a program of experimental psychology. In 1879, he complemented his lectures on experimental psychology. The response to new science was immediate and global. Wundt attracted students from around the world to study in a new experimental psychology and work in his lab. Students were trained to offer detailed reports of their reaction to various stimuli, a procedure known as introspection. The goal was to identify the elements of consciousness. The work of Wundt and his students demonstrated the mind could be measured, and the nature of consciousness could be related to scientific needs. It was an exciting proposition and one that found great interest in America. After the opening of Wundt's lab in 1879, it took just 4 years for the first psychology laboratory to open in the US. Wundt's version of psychology arrived in America most visibly through the work of Edward Titchner. A student of Wundt's, Titchener brought to America a brand of experimental psychology referred to as structuralism. Structuralists were interested in the content of what mind is. For Titchener, the general adult mind was a proper focus for the new psychology, and he excluded from study those with mental deficiencies, children, and animals. William James was one of the leading figures in the new perspectives on psychology called functionalism. While Titchener and his followers adhered to structural psychology, others in America were pursuing different approaches. William James, G. Stanley, and James McCain were among the group that became identified with functionalism. Influenced by Darwin's evolutionary theory, functionalists were interested in the activities of mind, what the mind does, and interest in functionalism opened the way for the study of a wide range of approaches, including animal and comparative psychology. Opposed to the reductionist ideas of Titchener, James proved that consciousness is ongoing and continuous. It cannot be isolated and reduced to elements. For James, consciousness helps us to adapt to our environment in such ways as allowing us to make choices and have personal responsibility. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, psychology continued to grow and flourish in America. It was large enough to accommodate varying points of view in nature on mind and behavior. Gestalt psychology is a good example. The Gestalt movement began in Germany with the work of Max Wertheimer, Kurt Kofka, Wolfgang Keller. Studying the whole of an experience was richer than studying individuals' aspects of that experience. The saying, "the whole is greater than some of its parts," is a Gestalt perspective. In America, a new audience was introduced to Gestalt perspective, demonstrating how it could be applied to perception and learning. In many ways, the work of Gestalt psychology served as a precursor to the rise of cognitive psychology in America. Behaviorism emerged early in the 20th century and became a major force in American psychology. Championed by psychologists such as J.B. Watson and B.F. Skinner, behaviorism rejected by reference to mind and view over and observable behavior. Through the scientific study of behavior, it was hoped that law of learning could be derived that would promote the prediction and controlled behavior. Russian psychologist Emil Pavlov influenced early behaviorism in America. His work on conditioned learning, known as classical conditioning, provided support for the notion that learning and behavior were controlled by events in the environment and could be explained with no reference to mind or consciousness. For decades, behaviorism dominated American psychology. By the 1960s, psychologists began to recognize that behaviorism was unable to fully explain human behavior because it neglected mental processes. The turn towards cognitive psychology was not new. In 1930, British psychologists explored the idea of constructive mind, recognizing that people use their past experiences. In America, there has always been an interest in the application of psychology to everyday life, as mental testing, model intelligence test. Model intelligence test developed by French psychologist Alfred Binet, a test that will identify school children in need of educational support. His test, including tasks of reasoning and problem solving, was introduced in the US by Henry Goddard. Applied psychology was not limited to mental testing. What psychologists were learning in their laboratories was applied in many settings, including the military, business, industry, and education. Clinical psychology was also an application. Leidner Whitmer opened a psychology clinic in 1896. Whitmer believed that because psychology deals with study and such unit perception, it would be a value in treating children. He is credited as the both founder of both clinical and school psychology. Growth and expansion have been a constant in American psychology. In the latter part of the 20th century, areas such as social development and personality psychology made major contributions to understanding of what it means to be a human. As mentioned at the beginning of the module, it is a challenge to cover all the history of psychology in such a short space. Errors of omission and commission are likely in such a selective review. The history of psychology helps to set a stage upon which the story of psychology can be told. This brief summary provides some glimpse into depth and rich content offered by history of psychology. It is hoped that you will be able to see the connections that and great understanding of application for both the unity and diversity in the field of psychology.